Okay, we are recording. I love that fan. Today I'm going to talk to you about Tibetan Buddhism. I teach a 2-semester sequence in Asian philosophy and religion, and the fall course is the one on philosophy and religion of South Asia. And then in the spring I do philosophy and religion of East Asia. And this semester, this fall semester, philosophy and religion of South Asia, typically I end the class with Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. And in the spring class, the class on philosophy and religion of East Asia, typically I end that class on Zen Buddhism, Japanese, mostly Zen Buddhism. So, and one reason to do it, to end those two classes respectively on those two topics, is because those are sort of, I think, the two versions of Buddhism that come out of Asia into the West, into North America after World War II, that are since then, and certainly today, the really sort of charismatic versions of Buddhism, the versions of Buddhism that most people in a place like North America or Europe, I think, or South America, would think of when they thought of Buddhism. Buddhism is sort of, they have some images of Tibet, and excuse me, I take off my socks. They have some images of Tibet, and they have some images of Japanese Zen Buddhism. And one of the things then you're going to take away from today is a sort of aesthetic or stylistic difference between Tibetan Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism, and that is helpful in terms of understanding something about Asian art history and Asian style. So that's a nice subtext of studying Tibetan Buddhism, I think. Clearly, as you can see from this Tibetan prayer room in my mom's house, it has a beautiful style, but a very dense style. And that's one of the things, as I say, that we're going to be talking about today as we look at Vajrayana Buddhism. Why Vajrayana? Typically, we call Tibetan Buddhism Vajrayana. What Vajrayana refers to is that this is Tantric Buddhism. What does that mean, and why is Tibetan Buddhism Tantric Buddhism? That's what we're going to talk about here today. It's Tantric Buddhism. Hinduism is really quite tantric. Tantras are just practices. We're going to talk about that too. And what you have in Tibet is a kind of mix of Buddhism and Hinduism for some very interesting reasons. One important thing to understand about Tibetan Buddhism is kind of the mother of all social engineering. That is, Tibet was deliberately introduced into the country by upper class, sort of noble Tibetans in order to create social and cultural and political changes in Tibet. And it was at first disseminated, as Buddhism always was, as Siddhartha Gautama always disseminated it, first to very upper class, ruling class kinds of people. You typically, if you had a good enough reputation, when you came around to a country, you went to the palace and you talked to the people there. An important thing to understand about these teachers too. So let's get on with it. A little bit about the geography of Tibet. We call the Tibetan Plateau the roof of the world. You see Tibet, the lighter colored country there, and Lhasa is the capital. And notice how there are these thin countries, Nepal and Bhutan, between Tibet and India. Remember, Siddhartha Gautama, very close to the Nepalese border, is the place where he was born. And it was a Nepali princess, actually, who was married to the king of Tibet, who introduced Buddhism into Tibet. So the reason those countries are there is because that's where the Himalayas are. Tibet is a giant plateau that is ringed, particularly to the south, by the Himalayas, the largest, steepest mountain range on Earth. And Tibet is the highest place on earth, the highest country on earth. So sometimes people call it the rooftop of the world. And Tibet and those other countries in the Himalayas, those Himalayan kingdoms, were really not opened up to or explored by the West until quite significantly later than the countries that have coasts on the various oceans of Asia there. It took a long time before the West kind of got to know Tibet, and Tibet is still pretty isolated from us today. So this is one thing that's, I think, really interesting about Tibet. Again, a case of kind of social engineering on a fairly grand scale. Tibet had a warlord raider culture. It had been these people like the Mongols to the north. They had been riding out of the mountains down in raids on people in the flatlands for a long, long time, many, many, many generations. And you did have a Tibetan unified empire in the 7th to the 9th centuries of the Common Era. Now we're talking about medieval times in Europe, and including large parts of China. I mean, there's kind of you might hear people say that Tibet used to be part of China or something like that. Well, Tibet used to occupy a lot of China. Tibet and China historically are two very, very different countries, notwithstanding nationalistic claims. So Songtsen Gampo, and there's that unmistakable Tibetan name, Tibetan language, Songtsen Gampo. The 33rd Tibetan king introduced Buddhism to Tibet in the 7th century, the 600s. As I say, he had a Nepali Buddhist princess wife, and that's interesting since it was, look at that, almost about 1,000 years earlier, and maybe even a little bit more than 1,000 years before then, that Siddhartha Gautama was born south of Nepal, not that far away from where the Songtsen Gampo's wife came from. Another interesting thing, just to look at again, this sort of social engineering aspect of it, was that Songtsen Gampo actually was the one who arranged for there to be a Tibetan script, a Tibetan written language, and some kind of written language for the spoken Tibetan language. I don't know much about the Tibetan language, to say the least. But the point here is that the reason that Songtsen Gampo had that script developed was specifically because he wanted to spread Buddhism into Tibet. There was pushback. It took a couple hundred years before all of these sort of powerful elements in Tibet accepted Buddhism. It was definitely a political thing, among other things. But it succeeded, and then as it says there in the second half, between 750 and 800, King Trisong Detsen proclaimed Tibet to be a Buddhist country, and in fact, he had all of the government functionaries. He made them all become Buddhist monks and take on the Buddhist robes and give up all their belongings and everything. So it's kind of a heavy-duty change of administration that they had there. And as I say, then in Tibet, as in, say, Catholic countries, the politics of this centralized church, if you will, have always been a big part of the politics of the nation, the cultural nation. As I say, historically, Tibet and China were rivals. Here we are around the turn to the 9th century. And you see there that there was a time when Tibet occupied a great deal of what today is China. So this historical relationship between Tibet and China is very old and rather fraught. And so Tibet hasn't always been this tiny little country that someday got discovered by an explorer. There was a time when the Tibetans ruled over a huge swath of Central Asia. So what's the meaning of this Vajrayana, this Sanskrit word? Let's look at two words here, Tantra and Yoga. One of the things that we've seen quite a bit looking at Asian philosophy and religion is that you usually have sort of two lives of these words for people in my kind of situation here teaching in Puerto Rico where I am. That is, you've got the actual Sanskrit meaning that you're going to encounter in any kind of serious inquiry into Buddhism. And then you've also got a kind of pop culture usage that's been around at least since the 1960s or 50s, earlier in the 20th century, when Buddhism did become a popular part of Bohemian culture in the West, in North America and Europe. A lot of Buddhist stuff coming in from California is something that you can still see today. And in fact, the United States has the largest Buddhist population outside of Asia and the largest ethnic European population of Buddhists anywhere in the world. Alrighty, anyway, so very roughly here too, by the way, Tantra, as maybe say a technique is a Tantra, or discipline might be a Tantra. You have like a, a way that you approach things, or techniques for doing things. Yoga, then the practice, but not a big difference in those things. So you have like I would say you have like a dishwashing yoga is what I would call it, because that's a practice, right? So you have a dishwashing yoga. What do I mean by your dishwashing yoga? Well, you yourself just have, if you do the dishes, the way that you do them, the time, the way, what you use, all of that. And all of that is just your dishwashing yoga. Everything's your yoga. There's your, and again, Tantra is yogic technique. So chanting mantras, for example, sitting meditation, we're going to talk about some Vajrayana meditation that's a little bit different from the usual mindfulness meditation today, and practicing what we usually call yoga, as in yoga pants or whatever. All of these are examples of Tantra. These are Tantras, among many, many other things. Okay. So Vajrayana, what does it mean? What about Vajrayana? Vajrayana kind of means this. Let me step out and see if I can step out. Sometimes I step out and I forget what I was going to say. But Vajrayana, as in, or Tantric, as in that way, similar to Hinduism, it's really Hindu teachings and Hindu sects that are involved in a lot of Tantra, a lot of techniques, including, as I say, there's hand gestures, mudras, there's mantras, chanting, different kinds of yogas, diets. And this is very characteristic of the Hindu tradition, that there will be a bunch of tantras that you might learn from your teacher, from your guru, or that sort of thing. So all very Hindu. And in a sense, so King Henry VIII, it's a long story, let's not get into it, but he had a lot of problems at home. And he too was in a rather politicized religious situation, King Henry VIII of England, And so he had to sort of form his own church, he just couldn't deal with Rome anymore. Rome was too much of a pain, so he had to do something about it. So he formed the Church of England. But if you're going to make a Church of England, to replace the Church of Rome, then it's got to give a lot of the same kind of stuff. And sure enough, this is the Anglican Church in North America, call it the Episcopalians, Church of England, or the Church of Ireland, same deal. And if you go to there, what you see is, guys in long robes and funny hats and incense stenchers and junk like that. And it's like Catholic stuff, all that kind of stuff. And why is that? Well, because that was the church that was supposed to replace Catholic Church. So it's got the liturgy, it's got all this stuff. And in a sense, then, what I'm getting at with my simian simile is that Vajrayana, Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, with its heavy-duty reliance on tantric practices, which are otherwise pretty much found in Hinduism, is kind of like what the Church of England is to the Catholic Church, Vajrayana is to classical Hinduism, sort of. And so even the mandalas obviously the wheel of karma is something that comes from Hinduism. And another meaning or symbolism of some of the mandalas and wheels were actually sort of layouts of palaces of kings and princesses and gods and things, because we're going to talk about positive visualization, which is sort of another really strikingly different form of meditation that characterizes Vajrayana or Tibetan Tantric Buddhism from other kinds of Buddhism. So, alrighty then, let's go back to sharing the screen. And come on, there we go. Okay, so and so then the last thing there that I, just to say that last bullet point there is it, and what is it? It's this very dense, what sometimes in slangily we call Baroque in terms of talking about Western styles, kind of really dense texture. Okay. Like that. I mean, there's just your basic Buddhist throne room. And actually in private Buddhist homes, people have very elaborate kind of Buddhist prayer centers that they build in their homes, real nice looking ones. So there's all sort of subgenre of Buddhist altars that's really quite nice. And then obviously in the big temples, you're going to have some really impressive throne rooms and prayer rooms. But you see what I mean by this kind of very densely textured, very ornate, and in general, tantric, right? A bunch of different deities. You can chant to different ones. There's lots of prayers, lots of ritual, lots of the stuff that ordinary folks really want and need if they're going to have some kind of spiritual or religious practice that's holding them together. If you want the really, and so I say sometimes redneck, not in the sense of anything pejorative. And so I don't think, I'm not against rednecks, especially. I don't know. I don't want to get into that. But what do I mean by redneck in this context? For heaven's sakes, just that out in the boonies, in the Himalayas, you meet Buddhists who are like church going, prayer wheel, spinning, dogmatic Buddhists, good old down to earth hometown religion Buddhists. And that's a lot of what Tibetan Buddhism is about. The only other place you see a lot of that is in some of the Theravadan schools of the Southeast, which again are older. And so you get this kind of ecumenical kind of feel. So here's, I would say, one of the takeaways from today. And this is just a really basic thing, right? This is a really basic thing that you should know about Asian art, that you should be able to just see in Asian art. And that is that in this Tantric Himalayan culture, you get those mandalas. They are religious iconography. They are heavily symbolic. They also are manifesting the infinities on infinities of being, of levels of being, chains of being, higher deities. And then in the Chinese is really where it comes from. In Japanese Zen schools, you have a naturalism. And how is it, and I'll talk about that in the other class, but just now, just in 30 seconds or something, how is the Buddhism manifested there? It's manifested in the kind of spontaneity that one gets from mindfulness meditation, where the mind is cleared of thoughts and feelings. And so real spontaneity can be used to achieve beauty. It also has, the trick of it is you work and work and work on your muscle memory, and then you can work spontaneously. That's kind of, I think, kind of the paradox of Zen art. But Zen art is really cool. And in general, as I say, the naturalistic landscape tradition of classical Chinese art, that tradition where we find also the images of scowling Bodhidharma, that's Chinese and Japanese naturalism. So one thing that when you get your job designing nuclear submarines and you go to the wine and cheese party and you went to college, what you ought to be able to see, because you took this class, is that when you get those psychedelic mandalas, you're looking at Hinduism or Tibetan Buddhism, and when you get those austere brushstroke naturalistic mountain landscapes and tree landscapes and seascapes, you're looking at Far Asian, Chinese, and Japanese art, and Zen would be the association. All right. There is some worthwhile Tibetan Buddhist writings, and there are some really great projects going on these days in terms of translating all of the Tibetan Buddhist writings because of cultural pressure in Asia, notably from the Chinese occupation of Tibet. There is a tremendous amount of work being done to translate just a mountain of Tibetan writings. So there's a lot of stuff to study. What I would recommend are 2 points here. The first is probably the canonical poet of Tibet is the scholar, teacher, poet, Buddhist monk Milarepa, who lives and writes in the 11th century, time of the Norman invasion of England and all that, 1066 and all that. Anyway, apparently his father was killed, and the story is that his father somehow, who was a political person, was killed in some treacherous thing, and his mother became embittered and vengeful, and Milarepa became a poisoner and an assassin and killed a whole bunch of people until finally he overcame these negative thoughts and feelings and became and sought, refuge in the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha, and became a monk. His basic text is 100,000 songs, which you can find some translations of. A very large work of devotional poetry, considered his masterpiece. And then there's a 15th century writing called The Life of Milarepa, where it appears Milarepa himself is sort of a stand-in for kind of the classic sort of 15th century ideal of a Buddhist monk. And then you have another thing, the mind training or the wisdom teachings of Tibet. Again, Tibet has this homely side because it was all about proselytizing and teaching Buddhism to this kind of rootsy rural population of people who had grown up on warlordism and yak butter, right? I mean, that's just, that's the stereotype of it. Again, the people who are really into it were very upper class people. But typically what you have are these stories, edification stories, stories with a moral. And it's a young prince or someone like that, and a charismatic young man, but sort of adrift or else on the wrong path and so on, sometimes with responsibilities that he's abusing. It's the same story a lot. And then shit happens and then they become Buddhists, like King Ashoka kind of deal. So that's sort of a really classic narrative. And, there are some others, but you get the drift. But it is worth looking into the mind training literature. And in general, there's, if you want to remember this, let me just step out of this for a second just to make a plug here. So the actress Uma Thurman, who's in those Quentin Tarantino movies, well, her father is this man named Robert Thurman, and Robert Thurman is just about probably the greatest Tibetan Buddhist scholar in the United States, but perhaps, certainly one of the best in the world, and a very close associate of the Dalai Lama. And he just comes out with a lot of books. I would recommend The Jewel Tree of Tibet. I'm going to talk about guided meditation in a minute here, and so that might help you remember that Robert Thurman's book is The Jewel Tree of Tibet. But it's easy to remember because it's really easy to remember Uma Thurman. So just remember that it's Uma Thurman's father is this amazing Buddhist scholar. His name is Robert Thurman, and you should check out some of his books, but also some of the translations that he also is involved in making with these Tibetan translation projects. So there's just if you just clue into that stuff on like Amazon, you'll find all sorts of really cool books to look at. Okay, so let me go back to, am I sharing or am I not sharing? I don't even know where I am. Here we are. Okie dokie, trade professional. All right, so let me finish up here just talking about the Dalai Lama. I like to maybe try and just get, what's interesting about Tibetan Buddhism across to people without having to get into this whole horrible thing about the Chinese occupation of Tibet. But there's a couple things about the Dalai Lama that I think are really interesting in terms of just thinking about what Tibetan Buddhism is. I mentioned that there's all these translations and all this interpretive literature now about Tibetan Buddhism. And I find that reading it, for example, reading Robert Thurman, who I mentioned a minute ago, I have to sometimes just go along with the magic, because sometimes they're just talking magic. And so if I just want to understand this narrative, I just say, okay, well, this is magic. So, all right, we'll just talk magic. It does this, and this is magic. And, you know, I'm pretty nerdy. I mean, I'm not real big on, you know, ghosts and goblins and stuff. But there are a couple of cool things about the Dalai Lama. So the 14th Dalai Lama passed away in 1933. That's what I'm trying to remember. Who also, by the way, was a very distinguished person and a very important political leader. And he passed away. And the tradition is that the Dalai Lama then reincarnates into another incarnation after passing away. And this is the Avalokitesvara, who is a embodied Bodhi who is the embodiment of the compassion of all Buddhas. So, okay, fine. So then looking at things like the direction that the head of the body of the 14th Dalai Lama was pointing, I think. And I've seen also some reference to divining by looking at mosses nearby. In any event, they are led to a small village in the countryside where there's a very large farming family, a simple family, and they locate a 2-year-old child there who then they show various objects. One version of this is that you have 2 objects. One used to belong to the Dalai Lama, the other did not. And then you might say, well, the one that did belong to the Dalai Lama was very homely. It was just a little, you know, nondescript looking little thing. And the thing that wasn't the Dalai Lama's was all bright and shiny and attractive. But nonetheless, the infant chose, you know, the drill, the dowdy little thing that actually belonged to the Dalai Lama, and so forth and so on. You know, I mean, that's the idea of the magic. And so, okay, all right. And so he's identified at age 2 in 1937, 4 years after the death of the 14th Dalai Lama. And finally, in the year 1950, he becomes the 15th Dalai Lama. And China invades China in 1959, and he flees across the border into Dharamsala in northern India, which is where he has his community of Tibetan exiles to this day. And in 1989, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He's been around for a long time. He's been the Dalai Lama since 1950. But here's the thing that I want to say. Let me step out again, because I really do think, because like I say, I'm very skeptical. I don't do like magic and stuff. But so they find this little kid by these divination techniques. Now, and then he turns out the Dalai Lama, the Dalai Lama runs conferences on cognitive neuroscience and meditation and computational models and meditation and stuff. I mean, as well as teaching, you know, these Vajrayana teachings, including secret Tantric teachings that the Dalai Lama only gives to the most important other people to pass on down the line. But he also is an expert in all kinds of things, and he also is a champion of all kinds of progressive causes, not only in Tibet, but all around the world. And he is, one way you know that he's important is he is sort of public enemy number 1 to the Chinese government. You can quickly be criticized by all sorts of angry young Chinese nationalist men if you say nice things about the Dalai Lama or defend the culture of Tibet and claim that there's anything wrong with the Chinese occupation. A lot of apologists. Alrighty then. So the point though is this. I'm sorry. They find this little kid. I mean, it could be that it's the training, right? I mean, they could be that they have such good training that if they take a little child who's 2 or 3 and raise them up, like they also used to do this with the Emperor of China. And they're raised up by these so-called experts, these monks. And it's rigorous, I guess. As I say, these Dalai Lamas over the generations tend to be very distinguished people. They're political leaders. They have to make a lot of decisions. They're not just figureheads. And this guy, the Dalai Lama, is an amazing person. So, and the Dalai Lama also says that he thinks it might be contrary to the spirit of Buddhism to keep insisting that the Dalai Lama is going to keep being reincarnated, because the Chinese have now like kidnapped a couple of infants who are going to be, there's a couple other lamas like the Pachen Lama, and the Chinese claim that they get to decide who the Dalai Lama is going to be. And the Dalai Lama actually officially retired from his administrative duties in 2012. And he actually is willing to say, well, maybe, it's the spirit of Buddhism just to let, this tradition of Dalai Lamas disappear now. I mean, So that's all very interesting. And one of the things, obviously, if I'm going to talk about it, I'm going to talk about it in terms of, Buddhism, understanding Tibetan Buddhism and Vajrayana Buddhism. Okay. And there he is in 1935, when he is identified as the Dalai Lama. And there he is in 2012, when the year that he retired from his official duties, although obviously he is still the Dalai Lama and still the main spokesman and head of international Buddhism. Okay. So let me stop that. So that's the takeaway. I mean, what is the takeaway? Vajrayana, what is it? It's Buddhism with a heavy Tantric accent. One of the things that's cool about it is that it's not just Hindu iconography. It's Buddhist iconography done over in this kind of Tantric Hindu manner. So the art is really nice. All the beautiful mandalas and the mandala sand paintings, which of course, why are there sand paintings? We also find this tradition in the southeastern tribes, indigenous tribes of North America. And the reason is because they come to be and pass away. They are transient. So you make your beautiful object knowing that very soon it will cease to exist. So that's a spiritual gesture, as everything should be. So Vajrayana, the Tantric Buddhism of Tibet, it's a very striking and very unique cultural entity, and a very, very precious part of our international matrimony or patrimony. It's not matrimony, it's patrimony. I'll look that up. You got the point. And I shall see you anon.